Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to this week's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing, and really appreciate you guys coming by the channel to check it out and spend some time with me today, because I know that these advanced bass fishing videos are longer than my normal videos and it takes a little more commitment. So thank you very much for making some time out of your day for it. Guys, today we're going to be talking about wind, or the lack of wind, and how it affects bass and the techniques that you can use. And I'm going to tell you guys right now, I've been doing the advanced bass fishing videos now for about a year. And out of all the videos I've done, I think this is probably the most important one I've done in terms of helping you understand more about bass behavior and movement, and just to help you catch more fish in general. These type of videos, they're not as popular as like if I show you guys baits and colors of lures and stuff like that. But man, I'm telling you, understanding how wind affects fish, or the lack of wind, and how you need to approach it, it's huge. It's a huge factor in the success that you're going to have bass fishing. So we'll get into that today's video. Also, guys, for get started, just a couple quick housekeeping tips to keep the videos up here on YouTube for advanced bass fishing. If you guys like the content here, guys, and you want to support the channel, the best thing you can do by far is just to go into my link. The links I put in the description of every advanced bass fishing video, and use and bookmark that tackle warehouse link of mine in there to purchase your tackle. Every time you buy something, like if you buy a reel or some worms, the channel gets a small percentage of that commission. That's a great way to support the channel, as well as checking out our Fish the Moment lake map breakdowns and our solar bat sunglasses. So I really appreciate that. Okay, guys, what do I want to do in this? I sort of want to break it down into seasons, and not necessarily like the seasons per se, but it's more about the water temperature in correlation with the seasons. Because when you're talking about wind, or the lack of wind, in my opinion, it has everything to do with the water temperature and the water clarity and correlation together, along with other factors. Because different things like the species of bass, like if it's a smallmouth or a spotted bass or a largemouth, has a different role in it. Water levels, the type of lake you're fishing, if it's a man-made or a natural, there's a ton of variables behind this. It's a pretty complicated topic, and I'm going to try to keep it on just an intermediate level. I don't want to go way off into left field, into theory and stuff like that, but we're going to break it up and stuff like that. So let's start out talking about the winter time of the year and sort of how that affects bass. Now, when I'm talking about the winter time of year, let's not talk in terms of winter, spring, summer, and fall. Let's talk about in terms of water temperatures as they change throughout the course of the year. In the winter time of the year, the key point on this in the winter time is when that water temperature is at its maximum lowest, or 5 degrees either side of it. So for the most part in the country, guys, you're going to have December through first part of March is going to be what is considered your lower water temperatures. This is the time of year where wind plays least of a factor of anything in terms of actually activating bass, whether they're active or not, and dictating techniques that the fish will bite based upon that activation. What you have on this is bass in the wintertime, they're usually deeper and they're usually suspended. So they're not affected by wind churning up the shallow water like they are in warmer water. So from that standpoint, there's no benefit whatsoever to having wind in the wintertime. But I want to preface that a little bit, because that's relative to the water temperature in the area that you're at. If you're in my part of the country, where we have water temperatures in the 40s during the winter time, you don't want any wind. It's not going to help you out at all. But if you fish like Sam Rayburn Lake in January, the water temperatures could still be in the 50s, and it might activate those fish over grass beds. You can catch them on a rattle trap or something. So it's relative to the water temperature as far as wind is going to hurt you or help you. But for the most part, I want to talk about water temperatures, and then you can relate it to your part of the area. If you have water temperatures in the 40s, wind is not your friend whatsoever. And it's not because the wind turns them off. It's because it makes it more difficult for you to fish the techniques that produce in 40-some degree water. For the most part, when you're talking about 40-degree water, you're talking about fishing slow techniques. You're talking about, working a jerk bait real slow. You're talking about crawling a swim bait real slow. Maybe fishing a jig on the bottom. Maybe slow cranking a crankbait. These are techniques that are slow reeling, and you can't get in a hurry fishing them. And that's the main thing about this, is like when you're trying to fish in cold weather like that, if there's wind, you simply can't slow down. Now, if I'm out on a main lake point and say there's no wind at all and it's water temperature is 40 degrees in January, I can get out there and I can twitch that jerk bait and I can let it set forever and my boat's not going anywhere. But if I get on that same point and that wind's blowing 15 or 20 miles an hour, I'm going to cast that bait out there. I'm going to twitch it a couple times. And then the next thing I know, I'm going to be blown past that point before that jerk bait can even sink. So, or set there very long. And so that's why wind hurts you in the cold weather, simply because you cannot slow down and make the correct presentation. So in the wintertime, you're going to find out that you're going to have a lot better success on those days that you don't have any wind or you have very light winds. Not because it makes the fish bite better, because it can make you more efficient with your presentation. This is the only time of year that wind actually is a negative. The thing that helps, and this is the focus of the video I want to get to as far as the meat and potatoes of it, is when that water temperature is over 50 degrees. Because when that water is over 50, that is when wind or lack of wind or different speeds of wind play a huge role in how the fish position and move and their activity and the techniques that you want to use for them with that. So let's get into 50 degree water temperature for the most part. Now, once that water temperature starts to get around 50 degrees, you start to have a larger population of the fish begin to move a little bit shallower in the lake. In the wintertime, when that water temperature is real cold, again, you have a lot of fish that are suspended. You have fish that are super deep because there's no thermocline, and they can go deep because, there's no thermocline. But as that water temperature starts to move up into the 50s and it's the pre-spawn, you have larger populations of fish moving up into that, that 3 to 15 foot zone. Some are still going to be suspended, some are going to be on the bottom, just depending upon, the water clarities and all that type of stuff. But basically you have a larger population shallow. And this is when wind starts to become your friend a little bit more, and wind starts to become a little bit more factor. Now, when that water temperature is down around 50 degrees, it's still pretty cool. So there's a period of which when that water gets 50, you start noticing that you can start catching some fish a little bit more on those windy days, but it really kicks in once that water temperature hits 55. When that water temperature hits 55 degrees on the surface, something happens, and those windy days will trigger bass to bite, especially if you have a south wind, a west wind, or a southwest wind. And let's talk a little bit about that first before we get into techniques and stuff as far as wind direction, because that's part of the whole wind. One of the things you're going to find out about wind is related to a lot of times to barometric pressure and different type of sky conditions. For the most part, when you have a south wind or a west wind or a southwest wind, it's usually associated with a stable barometric pressure or a falling barometric pressure. And it's usually associated with some type of cloud formations. Makes the fish more active. When you got a strong wind and you've got a falling barometric pressure and you got some clouds, that is the conditions where it really, really helps fishing out, especially when that water temperature is over 55 degrees. When you get situations like that, that is when you want to fish horizontally moving baits, active baits, larger baits, especially in the pre-spawn time of the year. So that's why, once that water hits about 55 degrees, it's a really good time of year to fish chatter baits, big spinner baits, full-size jigs, larger square bill crankbaits, moving baits that really capitalize on that the activity, or the increased metabolism and activity of the bass. Now, let's say, for example, this has happened in the second week of March. Water temperature is 55 degrees, you're catching them on moving baits, fish are up and active. You get a bad cold front comes through. As that cold front comes through, that barometric pressure starts to rise. You normally have a wind switch. The wind normally switches to the north or the northwest. And based upon the type of front that you have, you can either have a bluebird sky or you can have clouds for a couple days. If you have a bluebird sky associated with a strong north wind, that's going to really make the fishing tough. The fish are not as active. They don't want to chase. You can still catch them, but you're going to notice about half of the activity that you did prior. But if you have a day where you've got a front that comes through, you got a north wind, you've had a temperature drop, and you still maintain your cloud cover, it still can be good. You can still catch a lot of fish on those same type of bait. So it's all relative to the type of front that is actually coming in there. So here's what you have to do. When you start having 55 degree water temperature and you start to have wind associated with it, The best conditions are going to be is when you have areas where that wind is hitting the bank and creating some type of surface disturbance. Now, the wind speed has a lot to do with how effective this is going to be. And when I'm talking about wind, I'm not talking about having a strong wind. I'm talking about having a wind of about 10 to 15 miles an hour. If you're on a body of water that has a 10 to 15 mile an hour wind on just a typical lake out there, you're going to have a significant amount of surface turbulence. You may have a chop of about, anywhere between 6 to 12 inches hitting the water. And that can be very, very, good for the fishing, especially if your water clarity is right. One of the things you're going to notice when the water temperature is in the 50s and you have a significant amount of wind is that is going to be best if you have a little bit cleaner water. If you have water visibility of over about 2.5 or 3 feet. The clear water, especially in the springtime of the year, is really, really a big factor as far as activating those fish. Now, if you have a dirtier water situation where that water visibility is like under 1.5 feet, it actually can be a negative. You don't want that. You need to have a little bit of wind, but you don't want a lot of wind. So let's draw some analogies here. Let's say you're fishing and the lake you fish has 4 foot of clarity in it, and you've got a 15 mile an hour wind coming in on the bank that you're fishing. This is perfect. This is a great situation for like a crawdad crankbait or chatterbait or spinnerbait. But if you have that same situation, if you've got that 15 or 20 mile an hour wind coming in on the bank you're fishing and you have 12 inches of visibility, it's not going to be any good because it's going to, your water clarity and your water visibility is going to be a negative in terms of generating that strike. So if you have more off-colored water and that water temperature's in the 50s, you want a lighter wind. You want a wind that's probably calm to maybe a 5 mile an hour wind, just a nice gentle breeze against there in that off-colored water. So, what I'm talking about is if you're fishing in the springtime of the year and the water temperature's in the 50s, and you have water visibility less than 1.5 feet, you're going to need to look for those more protected areas. You're not going to be able to get out on those areas that are getting hit hard by the wind and expect to catch very many fish. So look for those more protected areas. You can always find that. And if you're on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're fishing clear water, you need to actively hunt out those windier areas. I'll give you guys a prime example here, like down at Table Rock or Bull Shoals Lake where I fish a lot. If you're fishing in, say, March and early April, and that water temperature is 55 degrees and you've got 4 to 5 foot of water clarity, you can take like a rock crawler or a wiggle wart on a windy day and go down a channel bank and you might rip them. And if you go there the next day and that wind is calm or barely blowing, you may not catch a fish. Clear water and wind will activate those fish to bite moving baits, as the others will not activate that. So that's a good rule of thumb during the pre-spawn. So I'm gonna take a quick break, guys, and then we're gonna get into the actual, when the water temperature starts moving up into the 60s. We'll be right back. Okay, guys, we're back. Now let's get into the hardcore springtime of the year when the water temperature starts to get around 60 degrees. Now, one of the things you're going to notice in and around the spawn, now this is when anytime the water temperature starts to get about 60 degrees, depending on 2 or 3 degrees on either side of it, you're going to have a big percentage of the fish in the lake that are either looking to build beds, they're up scouting areas to build beds, they're fanning beds, they're bedding, they're garden fry after they spawn. There's a lot of stuff going on once that water temperature hits that magic 60, 62, 63 degree range there. This is one time of the year, again, where you don't want much wind, because when those fish get locked in and they get ready to spawn and they start focusing on spawning, they don't want to hit moving baits very good. You can catch a few on a fluke and a floating worm once in a while, but the wind's not going to help you there either. For the most part, when those fish are in the mood to spawn, they're going to be locked in on the bottom, and your bottom baits are going to be a lot better, like your shaky heads, your tubes, your Ned rigs, your jigs, your Texas rig worms, your wacky rigs, Cinco, stuff like that. And this, for that reason, you don't need any wind. In fact, you don't want any wind. I have found out when that water temperature is around 60 degrees, I like the calm days because I want to be able to see fish. I want to see fish cruising around. I want to be able to lead them. I want to see the fish come up and hit my floating worm or my fluke, and you can do that without wind. So that is the time of year, guys, when wind, again, sort of like wintertime, it's not going to help you out any. If you say, for example, you go into a spawning cove where you think those fish are either getting ready to spawn or spawning, or they maybe have just got done spawning, and you've got a 15 or 20 mile an hour wind blowing in that spawning cove, it's not going to help you out at all. It's going to hurt you as far as being able to catch fish. So once again, if you're fishing when those water temperatures are around 60 degrees, look for those protected areas. The fish are going to really relate to that a lot better. Now, this is sort of the same regardless of the water clarity. Let's say, for example, if you can't see the fish, say you're in an off-colored body of water, it's the same thing. If you're in a dirty water lake where that water visibility is a foot or a foot and a half, and you're in those same type of areas where you know the fish are spawning but you can't see them, that's when you want to slow down with like your light sinker, light Texas rigs, Senkos, quarter-ounce jigs, some type of slow bait that falls real slow, and just methodically cast and pitch and flip your way back into those areas where you think those fish are bedding at or getting ready to bed at. And again, since you're fishing a lightweight with a bottom bait, wind's not going to help you out any. It's going to hurt you. So always look for those more protected areas. Now this starts to change once that water temperature starts to hit 70 degrees, because when that water temperature finally starts to get around 70, which in a lot of lakes across the country, it's going to be like May, early May, late April. Again, it's depending upon where you're at, because you sort of have to be relative to where you're fishing at. We'll address towards the end of the video some smallmouth stuff and different type of bodies, but for now, just for what most lakes are like. But once that water temperature starts to get around 70 and the majority of the fish are done spawning, that's when they have a shift in their mood and their personality and how wind affects, the techniques that you use and their ability to bite. Once that water temperature hits that 70 degrees, again, you have to clarify whether your water clarity is on the clear side or on the dirty side. Now, there's a couple different things that'll work really good in relationship to wind once that water temperature gets above 70. One of my favorite ways to catch them, after they get done spawning, is on a topwater lure. Topwater lures like a wake bait, a walking topwater, a popper, something like that, are really, really good in the month of May. And those are the conditions you want calm days. You don't want any wind whatsoever. Fish can see a topwater better, so that's what I'm looking for in the month of May. But at the same time, if you have a clear water situation in the month of May and the water temperature is over 75 degrees, you can still catch a lot of fish on those windy days or the moderate wind days by going to the type of lures that are conducive to fish under those conditions. So one of my favorite ways to catch them, if you have a windy day or moderately windy day in the late spring, is on a glide bait or a big swim bait. Something like that 6-inch megabass mag draft or some type of a small glide bait. That will activate those fish, those wind. Now, you won't be able to catch many on it if the wind doesn't blow, but there's something about it that they will bite it if the wind blows. And a lot of times, let's say, for example, it's the first or second week of May and you're fishing a main lake point and you're catching a few on a Zara spook on a calm day, but you can't get any fish on a glide bait or a swim bait because it's calm out. You could probably come back the next day if that wind's blowing 10 or 15 miles an hour into that point and throw that mag draft or that glide bait, and you can catch fish doing that if the wind blows a little bit. And those are going to be the same fish that will hit your topwater the day before, but that's the difference as far as what wind does to fish. It's like on a calm day, your subtle baits and your topwaters are going to draw strikes, and they're not going to draw strikes on windy days, yet other lure categories will. Now, if you're fishing a off-colored body of water during the post-spawn, and again, the water temperature is around 70 degrees, this is when I like to go back to my moving baits. Your shallow running crankbaits, like a square bill crankbait, is going to work good. Spinner bait, chatterbait, a swim jig. Swim jig is one of my favorite lures to use on a windy day, especially if the fish are up shallow. So I like to go back into those flatter areas. If I got a 10 or 15, 20 mile an hour wind blowing back in a pocket, I'll take a swim jig and throw it up there on the bank. A lot of times that'll activate those fish. In general, though, when that water temperature is around 70 degrees and those fish are active, if that water visibility is under about 2 foot, you can catch them pretty good on a moving bait under those situations there. I'm going to say, guys, that there's 2 times of the year where wind plays a huge role in the techniques that you need to use in the activation or deactivation of the fish. And that is when the water temperatures are in the 70s and in the late springtime. And the other is going to be what we'll talk about here in a little bit, when the water temperature is like in the 60s in the fall time of the year. I'm going to take a quick break and get a drink, guys, and we're going to get back into the late spring and early summer situation. Be right back. Okay, guys, we're back. We're going to get into the early summer type of the deal here as far as wind and no wind. And one of the things I found out about it, it's like we talked about the spring and the fall being the most important aspects of wind or no wind, and the other part of it, as far as when it has the least amount, is in the summertime of the year. Winter would be the least, summer would be second, probably fall would be third, and spring would be fourth. So let's get into a little bit about what you need to look for in the summertime of the year. Now, one of the things that you will find out about bass fishing as far as summer bass is that as that water temperature gets hotter, and as the water temperature begins to max out in June and July and August, weather patterns have a lot less of an effect on a bass than they do, pretty much any other time of the year except for the winter time. I'll use a cold front, for example. Let's say if you have a front come through in the middle of July and you had a south wind leading up to it that we talked about earlier, then you maybe have a north wind for a few days after a summer front. It doesn't do much to the fish. The fish simply they're not as affected by it, and they don't react to it because the water temperatures are warm, their metabolisms are pretty high, and you don't notice much with it. One of the things that you will find out about summer bass is that where they live at, if they live in shallow water, mid depths, or deep water, they are not as affected by wind or cloud conditions or temperatures as like they are the rest of the year. It's just sort of a reality of the situation. But here's a couple different things I'll give you guys some tips and advice on catching bass in various wind conditions during the summertime of the year. And I do want to follow up at the end of the video, guys. I want to talk about northern smallmouth a little bit because that's a completely different game up there. Summertime of the year, the number one factor as far as that will benefit you in the summertime is if you're in a off-colored water situation where the fish are shallow, especially when they're shallow around some type of rock. If you have water visibilities that are like less than 1.5 feet deep and you've got some rocky banks, or particularly banks that are flatter in that dirty water, a little bit of wind or a moderate wind hitting those banks can be a really good thing, because you can take like a small shallow running crankbait, and in that off-colored water where the water's warm and shallow, sometimes that will activate those fish. It doesn't do that if the water temperature is cooler, but in the summertime, that's a pretty good indicator with it. I'll say, for example, guys, I'll give you one prime example. I fish Grand Lake a lot in the summertime down there, and Grand Lake has a lot of off-colored water and flat rocky banks. And in the middle of the summer down there, you can get on some of those flat rocky banks. And if the wind is hitting them pretty good and you've got like a 15-mile-an-hour wind hitting them, I can take like a little rattle trap or a small crankbait like that Megabass Super Z2, and I can catch a bunch of fish in less than 2 foot of water in that dirty water with the wind blowing on it. But if the wind is not blowing on it, you can still catch a few occasionally, but not near as good. It's like that wind hitting it, the shatter up shallow, it stirs up the water a little bit. It stirs up the minnows, the bait fish, gets the fish a little bit active, and that's a really good, technique for catching them. Now, if you're fishing other summertime structures, like say you're fishing deeper points or deep brush piles or around boat docks, something like that, again, the wind doesn't do anything to help you out. It's sort of like the winter time, because if you're out there trying to fish offshore on a deep point and you've got maybe a brush pile and 20 foot of water, it doesn't make any difference to those bass if the wind's blowing 20 or if it's completely calm out there. It's not going to have any impact on those fish biting, but it's going to have a big impact on your ability to present that bait. And that's another reason in the summertime of the year, if I'm fishing offshore structures, I don't want very much wind. In fact, calm days are fine, or a little puff of wind. The lack of wind or wind is not going to affect those fish biting, but it's really going to affect your ability to put that bait where you need to. If you're fishing offshore or deeper in the summertime of the year, it's to your benefit to find those protected areas a little bit that will allow you to make those presentations where you can keep your boat in one position and cast right along that drop off or right to that brush pile. So that's not going to really play much of a factor. Same if you're fishing shallow water cover. If you're fishing shallow laydowns or docks or stumps or something like that, the wind is not going to activate those fish anymore. I would rather have a calmer type day where I can make real accurate presentations, pitching and flipping, throwing that crankbait or that spinnerbait next to that laydown log. My accuracy of my cast is more important than the wind hitting that for the most part. Like I said, the only situation where I see a positive to the wind in the summertime of the year is if you're fishing those, rocky banks that don't have much cover on it. They're in shallow water. Top water is a little bit different type of a situation because in the summertime of the year, one of the things that I have been able to do is I've been able to catch fish on windier days on those clear water lakes in the summertime. One of my favorite ways to catch them in the summer, guys, is I'll get out like on a main lake bluff bank that has some clear water, and I'll parallel that bluff bank with a walking topwater. And if you've got a lake that has clear water and some type of spotted bass mix in it, the water being churned up a little bit by a 10 or 15 mile an hour wind will actually make those fish bite better. It's like I can go down like to Table Rock Lake and I can parallel a bluff in the middle of July with a walking topwater on a calm day and never get a bite. But I might be able to go back there if that wind's hitting at like 10 to 15 miles an hour, throw that walking topwater next to that bank parallel, and I can catch fish. So it's all, relative to what you're fishing with that. So that's a little bit of an overview of summer. Now we're going to take another little quick break. We're going to get back into what I consider probably one of the most important times of the year for wind and the fall time of the year. Okay, guys, let's get into the fall time of the year, and then we're going to finish up by talking a little bit about smallmouth towards the end of it. Now, fall time of the year is super, super critical as far as techniques and wind, as far as if the fish are going to activate or not. And also, once you start getting into the fall time of the year, cold fronts have a lot more of an effect than they did any other time of the year except during the pre-spawn. So the fall time of the year, guys, it's depending upon what part of the country you're in, there's a lot of different stuff going on. And the fall is all relative to the part of the country you're in as far as the water temperatures you have in it. And normally, for most of the country, what you have is there's a slow transition into fall. And I sort of classify fall as starting sometime around mid-September. The very first time you start seeing some consistent cooler nights. It doesn't have to be very much cooler, but it seems like if you guys live in my part of the country, we still have 100-degree days in September. But usually by the end of like the mid part of September, there's a significant cold front that comes through sometime during the month of September. And for whatever reason, it seems like once that significant cold front comes through around, mid to late September, then there's a transition. It's like once that cold front comes through, you never have those super hot days again, and the fish start to really react to that. Now, you're going to notice there's not going to be much going on as far as the difference between from about July until the mid part of September in terms of how the wind affects the fish. But once you start getting into the mid to end part of September, where your nights start to get going a little bit cooler and you start to notice a little bit of a dip in the water temperature. Say, for example, in first part of September, your water temperatures are still in the low 80s, mid 80s, and by the end of September, you're down to in the upper 70s. That's when you start having this transition a little bit. The transition starts to take place in terms of wind or lack of wind becoming a little bit more important. Now, let's talk a little bit about windy days, and we'll go down to least windy days as far as the fall progresses. In the fall time of the year, wind is going to be really, really critical again for your power fishing baits. And one of my favorite techniques to utilize on windy days, anytime that water temperature is over, say, 60 degrees, is fishing a spinnerbait fast, what I call burning a spinnerbait. And guys, this is probably my number one technique for catching bass on windy days in the fall time of the year, is get you a little small spinnerbait, like a 3/8 ounce. I like that Mega Bass, SV3, the little small bladed spinnerbait, and wake it on steep banks and points. So what I mean is if you get one of those days out there where that wind's blowing 15 or 20 miles an hour, get out there on some main lake points or some banks that have a steep angle on it, throw that spinnerbait out there in that wind and burn it just underneath the surface about that far. And guys, that's some of the funnest fishing you'll ever have. That's the number one way to take advantage of wind in the fall time of the year, as long as that water temperature is above like 60 degrees. But the thing about that is those fish, they're starting to move shallower a little bit. Now, there's still a diversity of different stuff going on. There's still some fish suspended. There's still fish deep. Thermoclines start to break up. So actually in the fall time of the year, as the fall goes on, the fish can actually move deeper, but you're going to have a larger percentage of those fish move shallower, particularly by the first part of October. And that's when you need to take advantage of it with the wind. So a spinnerbait is a really good technique to fish on those windy days. A chatterbait. I don't use a crankbait quite as much in the fall time of the year on windy banks. I really prefer to go to like the spinnerbait, chatterbait, glide bait, swim bait, something like that. Glide bait on a windy day in the fall, guys, is an excellent time to catch them. There's 2 windows for fishing a glide bait in terms of on windy days. Number one is in the first couple weeks of May is a really good time to fish them, like we talked about. And the other time is in October and November. If you get a windy day in October and November and you have water visibility of over about 3 feet, get out there on those main lake points or those windy bluffs and throw that glide bait and that big swim bait on those windy days, and you can definitely catch some fish. Now, once you start catching fish on those power baits in a clear water environment on a windy day, remember, as that wind starts going down and you start getting more towards a little puff of wind or a calm day, that's another good time of year to catch them on the top water. If you're catching them on a spinnerbait or a glide bait or swim bait on a windy day, you can go back to the same areas as long as you have water visibility of over about 3 feet and catch them on a walking bait or a wake bait or anything like that. It's like the fish are there, but it's like the wind will dictate the technique that you use. And in general, this is one thing you need to remember about fall time fishing. It's like if it's really windy out there, fish your moving baits, and as that wind goes down a little bit, either move to a slow bait on the bottom or a top water. And I know it sort of sounds like a paradox a little bit. You're either fishing deep on the bottom or up on top, but that's the difference between the 2 different populations of fish. Some fish that hit those top water lures, they're going to come up off the bottom and get it, or they're going to be suspended and get it. And other fish like that, their personality, they don't want to come up off the bottom, and you can catch them on a Ned rig or a football head jig or something slow along the bottom. Now, the wind also has an impact, on the off-colored water a little bit too. It actually can be your friend again, as long as that water temperature is over 60 degrees. If you've got some areas that you have some lay-down trees or stumps or rocky banks, good time of year to catch them on a square bill crankbait or some type of a small crankbait on those windier days. That activates those fish a little bit because they're, water's still warm enough for them to take advantage of it. So I do like a little bit of wind if I'm fishing shallow with the moving bait, but I don't like a lot of wind. As an overview with the fall time of the year, if you got one of those days where you got a windy day, it's blowing 20 miles an hour, put you that spinnerbait on, put you that big glide bait on, and fish the wind. Look for the wind. It's like run down the lake, and if you see a point where that wind's hitting that point really hard, pull up on there, make a few casts with that spinnerbait or that glide bait. If you go around to the next point and there's not much wind on it, maybe throw your topwater lure. So fish the wind or not fish the wind based upon the technique that you're fishing. And again, a lot of it has to do with the water clarity and the species of fish that you have in it. You're going to find out for the most part that if you've got spotted bass or smallmouth, that they're going to be a lot more aggressive and chasing in clear water in the fall time of the year than the largemouth, but nevertheless, the largemouth will still react to that to some extent. So, okay, we're going to take a quick break, guys. We'll be back to finish it up with smallmouth, and then we're going to do a general overview of wind or lack of view to wrap it up. So we'll be right back. Okay, guys, now we're going to sort of wrap it up here a little bit. We're talking about smallmouth up north in the summertime of the year as far as how smallmouth react to wind or lack of wind. And then we're just going to give you guys sort of a general overview of everything. Now, the one anomaly in bass fishing, guys, is smallmouth in the northern tier lakes. And arguably, without a doubt, it's the best bass fishing in the country. It's like smallmouth fishing. If you guys are lucky enough to live up on the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, St. Clair, all those northern tier lakes, you guys are spoiled because you have no idea how good you have it, because you don't have the fishing pressure. You got a shorter fishing season. You don't have as many tournaments. It's just so much better fishing. It's fishing south of up north, like the mid part of the country or down south, is a grind compared to up north. Smallmouth are easy to catch up north. They're the easiest bass to catch that there is. And there's a lot of different things they do with wind that are different than spotted bass and largemouth. Everything that I just talked about in the video, guys, with, different, how wind affects bass at different times of the year, throw it out the window when it comes to smallmouth, because it's not the same thing. So I want to talk a little bit about smallmouth in the summertime of the year, because that is the best time to fish for smallmouth, is sort of between June and late September for the most part. Now, one of the things you'll find out about smallmouth and big smallmouth up north, and I'm not talking about the guys out there spotlighting them with their weenie worms and forward-facing minnow out in 200 foot of water. I'm talking about traditional smallmouth fishing, getting up on the flats, getting up on those rocky banks and rocky shorelines and fishing for bass like they need to be fished for. If you have days that don't have much wind on it, it doesn't really have much impact on how good the fishing is. Smallmouth fishing up north is great. I don't care if you got a 20-mile-an-hour wind or a flat calm. You're not going to notice much difference. The only thing you're going to notice is your techniques required to catch them. But as far as the bass being aggressive or biting, it's really a weird deal, because it has such a huge impact on spotted bass and spotted bass and largemouth, but it has zero impact on smallmouth. If you're fishing a tournament on Lake St. Clair, if it's glass smooth out there, or if it's winds blowing 20 miles an hour, it's not going to make any difference on how many fish are caught. They're still going to catch a ton of fish. Okay, now if you're fishing a calm day for smallmouth up north, and you got clear water, most every smallmouth impoundment does, or every smallmouth lake has calm water, there's nothing better than a topwater. Topwater lures are by far the best baits for smallmouth. Walking topwaters, chuggers, wake baits, anything that you want to throw for them. They will absolutely hammer them, even on sunny days. You don't have to have the right low light conditions. You don't have to get out early in the morning. You can just get out there on those flats, throw a big topwater, and catch them all day long with it. Now, if you fish reaction baits, like a jerk bait or spinner bait or something like that, the fish will still follow them a lot of times, and sometimes you can get them to hit them, but they won't bite them as good. On the days that you have the wind out there, if you've got different levels of wind, anywhere between 10 to 20 mile an hour wind, go with your spinner baits, go with your jerk baits, go with your crank baits. Those are going to generate the strikes. The fish are still interested on calm days, but they don't commit to it, and that wind will make them commit to those baits that go into the water column. Because what you have is, as those baits go deeper, you need the wind to break the surface up and allow them to make a mistake a little bit. If that bait is up on the surface and they can't really get a look at it, all they see is a bunch of surface commotion, it doesn't make any difference if the wind's blowing or not. They're still going to come up and hammer the thing. So my recommendation, guys, if you're fishing up north, on those windy days, pick up something like, my favorite is like that Megabass Deep X 300, crank it over those flats, burn a small spinner bait, throw a jerk bait, anything like that on the windy days. And if it's calm out there, the only thing you need is a topwater lure, unless you want to finesse around with like a Ned rig or a tube. Now, if you're fishing a bottom bait, like a tube or a Ned rig or drop shot, they're going to bite it just as good if it's windy or if it's cloudy or whatever, or calm. It doesn't really matter with it. So anyway, that's just sort of a brief overview on northern smallmouth. Going to take a quick little break here. We'll be back to finish it up with some thoughts. Okay, guys, and finally, and just to wrap it up, I just sort of want to give you guys some final thoughts on this. This is a very difficult video to do. When you're talking about wind, man, it's hard to explain exactly what I'm talking about. I tried to give you guys sort of the best, brief foundation that I could, but ultimately there is so much surrounding as far as techniques and how fish bite versus different type of winds. Because here's what I'm talking about. It's like when you're trying to make a determination on how to fish as far as your bait selection or the area. Let's say you got anything between a calm condition up to a 20 or 25 mile an hour wind. That's the first consideration. The next consideration is, what is your water clarity relative to different wind conditions? It's like, what's your water clarity if it's if it's calm? What's your water clarity if it's windy? What's your water clarity if the wind's blowing 5 miles an hour? And add to that the type of cover that you're fishing. Are you fishing a point? Are you fishing a dock? Are you fishing a laydown? All of that is tied together, and then you have to tie it together with the species of bass, how they react, or don't react to different type of wind situations. So it's very confusing. If this video confused you, don't feel bad, because it is confusing, because there's no truly definitive answers to exactly what you need to do when the wind's blowing or when it's not blowing. ultimately, you have to let the fish tell you what they want. That's like anything else in bass fishing. You just have to experiment with it. But overall, you have to start somewhere. It's like when you're trying to catch bass, you've got to have a starting point. So the starting point I want to leave you guys with here is this. Sort of remember this is your baseline, but don't get locked into it. Try to experiment around it. When the water, I don't want to talk in terms of cold water or warm water. When the water temperatures are between like 60 and 75 degrees, this is the prime water temperature that you need to have for windy days to be productive. And coupled with that, if you have water visibility of anywhere between say 2 to 5 feet, if you got 2 to 5 feet of water visibility and you got water temperature between 60 and 75 degrees, all of your power baits are going to be really good regardless of the cover you're fishing. Your baits like your crankbaits, your spinner baits, your swim baits, your glide baits. If you have a situation where there's no wind out there, depending upon the water temperatures and the water clarity, again, your top waters and your slow baits are going to work better. They're either going to be on the bottom or you're going to pull them off the bottom with that clear water. Now, the difficult thing comes with this is when you don't have an extreme. When you have, say for example, the wind's blowing 8 miles an hour and you have 3 feet of visibility. You have medium water visibility and a medium wind. When you're talking about that mid-range, you got one extremity of windy clear water, another extremity of dirty calm water, and then you have every other range of possibility between there. When you're talking about those ranges of possibility between the extremes, that's when anything can literally work. Your top water, your power baits, your slow baits, your finesse baits, anything could possibly work. You just sort of have to fish and let the fish tell you what they want. But ultimately, you have to have some type of a starting point with it. For the most part, you're going to find that I prefer fishing on days that are either have like a 10 to 15 mile an hour wind or a calm day. Anything between that, there's a lot of stuff can work. There's a lot of different stuff to work, and you just have to sort of pick through it to see. But if it's calm, there's a handful of techniques that are going to work. And if it's windy, there's a handful of techniques that are going to work. And most of the best days I've ever had in fishing have come either on calm days or days where the wind's blowing in that 15 mile an hour range. So anyway, guys, this is a difficult seminar to do. I hope it made sense with you. Please feel free to shoot me some questions if you got any questions on it. And we'll keep picking through this. We'll try to break it up a little bit, in the future coming up and talk about specific, wind directions and wind speeds and what to do in that. But overall, I hope that gave you guys a starting point to begin with. So we'll talk to y'all next week.